Today we have Anthony Fernandez, which is an assistant professor at the University of Southern Denmark. He's professor in applied philosophy. He's a qualitative researcher who focuses on the dialogue between philosophy and healthcare, especially psychology and psychiatry. Today, psychiatry lives a so-called crisis of classification, primarily due to the inefficiency of DSM current categories. In your work, you focused on proposing a novel dimensional approach, the so-called phenomenological dimensional approach. What is it and how it differs from other dimensional approaches, such as the RDoC or the spectral approach?
Thanks for the question. So, I think in getting into this work, I was a bit surprised looking at how phenomenological psychopathologists dealt with the current diagnostic categories in things like the DSM. Because in many ways, phenomenological psychopathologists, psychiatrists, psychologists are critical of what's going on in what we think of as mainstream psychiatry. And they tend to be quite critical of the way that we frame the symptoms for each disorder. But for the most part, I found that they weren't very critical of the diagnostic categories themselves. They thought that, for instance, major depressive disorder is a legitimate category, schizophrenia is a legitimate category. The issue is just that we have to get more detail about the subjective side of it. And I saw that psychiatry itself, independent of phenomenology, was moving away from these, was actually quite more critical of the diagnostic categories than the phenomenologists were. And I found that quite surprising. So the dimensional approach that I've been working on is in fact inspired by those developments outside of phenomenology, especially by the RDoC, or the Research Domain Criteria Initiative, which is developed by the National Institute of Mental Health in the US. But of course it differs in some respects. So I was also unsatisfied with the RDoC because while it does include several different, matrices as they set it up, where they want to look at genetics and neurobiology and behavior, for experience they just refer to self-reports. And they don't have any clear criteria on how to develop a good self-report or how to study someone's experience. It's just a kind of add-on in there that doesn't seem to play a significant role. So I was actually thinking of the dimensional approach that I've proposed, the phenomenological dimensional approach, as one that could complement and fit into something like the RDoC, even if it's not entirely consistent with it or has some points of disagreement. I think there are also respects in which the kind of work we do with a phenomenological dimensional approach can actually be something that fills in those items of self-report within something like the RDoC. So again, I don't see it as necessarily in opposition to, although there might be some ways in which it ends up being opposed. There might be some dimensions that it doesn't agree upon or something like this. But the general idea here is that what phenomenologists already refer to as existentials or existential structures, things like selfhood, embodiment, affectivity, and so on, each of those can constitute some kind of broad domain with various dimensions within it, and we can start to do research along those dimensions that doesn't assume the legitimacy of the categories. And I also think this is substantially different from what I refer to as a spectrum or spectral approach, which we're seeing more and more in psychiatry, right? Autism spectrum, schizophrenia spectrum. And while at first, right, that might seem like something promising, that we're acknowledging the kind of diversity and heterogeneity of these, it really is just replacing the word syndrome. We should just call them syndromes. We're not really sure how all the pieces are related. We're not really sure if it's all one category. So that is something I definitely don't follow. But I do think something like the RDoC is potentially a good way to move forward.
I found it really interesting that you've been critical towards the fact that we use DSM for research, although it was previously conceived to be something to diagnose with. So this is really interesting because if you use DSM for research, then you never do something critical about it. You just assume it and you go circularly researching about something that you are assuming. So we move to the second question. How the integration between scientific and philosophical approaches can occur? How it is methodologically possible to integrate qualitative and quantitative research?
Yeah, great. So I think there are many researchers in phenomenological psychopathology who are now interested in doing more empirical work, and some of them are working more in qualitative directions and some of them more in quantitative directions, with some, perhaps a few, working somewhere at the intersection. In terms of how we'd actually bring those together, I think that sometimes the quantitative research gets ahead of itself in the sense that what it's trying to investigate in that quantitative way, say using psychometric surveys or something like this, if the items we're investigating are not particularly well defined and don't match on to the kind of the complexity of subjective experience, then we'll find ourselves in a situation where the data we're generating isn't really all that useful. So I see the qualitative work and kind of descriptive psychopathology at the experiential level as something that can give us more fine-grained conceptual distinctions that we can then turn into, for instance, items on a psychometric questionnaire. And that will be a more sophisticated way of doing quantitative research that's informed by qualitative research, which is itself also informed by these philosophical foundations.
Right. And one last question about the project that today has a closing event, the Renewing Phenomenological Psychology project. According to you, which paths have proven most fruitful following this project?
So I think a lot of the people who became involved in the project in getting some of the smaller Sandpit Awards and other awards to do visiting research days and things like that, one theme that seems to be cutting across them is this broad interest in kind of critical phenomenology and related areas of being much more sensitive to cultural context and how we find ourselves situated in our environments, and also being more willing to, I guess, be kind of political in a sense of bringing in, for instance, elements of the Mad Pride movement or elements of a neurodiversity movement, and trying to figure out how it is that those can actually be integrated with what we're doing in phenomenology and how we can also use those as standpoints from which to critique phenomenological psychopathology and develop it in new ways. So I think that's perhaps the most interesting element that's come out of the RPP project.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was an honor to have you today for this interview, and we hope to have you again sometimes in engaging in a conversation with the Italian phenomenology and our website.
That sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.